What up, nerds? Welcome back to the Nerdy Narrative. My name is Leslie Smith. Today I will be briefly recapping all of the things that I read during the month of October. Before we get into that, I would love to take a quick moment to thank today's video sponsor, James Flint. A Bunch of Fives is a collection that is going to smack you straight in the face with a mighty handful of powerful tales of fiction. This sucker packs a punch with 5 hard-hitting stories, all of which will leave you stunned, dizzy, and in a delirious stupor. Within these knuckle pages, you'll find a professional hitman taking on more than he bargained for, a strange creature roaming a Vietnamese island, a nymphomaniac in the midst of a breakdown, and much more. I will have both collections linked in the description box down below for you to check out. The release date for A Bunch of Fives is June 1st, 2023. There is a pre-order link that is already up for you. While you're waiting for this one to come out, if you would like to check out author James Flynn, I would highly recommend reading another collection that he has out called The Hand That Pulls You Under, Tales of Absurdity and Lunacy. It was a fantastic collection that had a lot of genre blending between science fiction, fantasy, and horror. So thank you very much to author James Flynn for sponsoring today's video, inspired by his new collection of short stories release, A Bunch of Fives. Alright, let's talk about what I read and what I thought. So I have been participating in a Joan Didion read-along with Kate from the Literary Apothecary. I believe this is our 1-year anniversary of working our way through the nonfiction essays, and the month of October, the title of the essay was On Going Home. It was interesting to see what I thought about it versus Kate. Kate has done extensive research on Joan Didion, and this one meant more to her than it did to me because I didn't know more about Joan Didion's life, her family. It was bittersweet for her because she knows that Joan lost her husband and daughter not too much longer after having written this essay, and it was simply about a time when Joan went home to visit her family for her daughter's 1-year birthday, and just how she felt being back with their family, how her husband felt a bit of an outsider because her family had their own way of talking to one another, falling back into their routine of the topics they like to talk about and that sort of thing. So for me, not knowing that much about Joan, I thought it was okay. Next here off the stack, I read The Dead Kids Club by Rich Hosek. I loved this thriller. Several of the reasons why I loved it were involved in the twists and turns this story takes. It's very fast paced, the story clips along, there's never any lulls, and I loved it. It just kept me turning those pages. It's about a couple who lose their son after a drunk driver jumps the curb 8 o'clock in the morning, runs over and kills their son Nick right as he is about to walk into his school. Even though the couple was already divorced before the death of their child, they attend a support group together for people who have lost a loved one, whether it be due to sickness, death, murder in some cases. And this is where things get interesting. If you're a fan of thrillers, of true crime, vigilante justice, wish fulfillment, revenge, humor, and all of it, then I think you would enjoy this book. So next up in October, I listened to, on YouTube, a dramatic reading of The V by Nikolai Gogel. I will absolutely have that linked down below in the description box if you would like to listen to it. It's very short and it is so good. This one reminded me of the type of story, kind of like the Sleepy Hollow with Ichabod Crane, where you're sitting around a campfire and you're leaning in close. The story centers around a philosopher. The philosopher has been requested to come to a house and deliver the rites for the daughter of a man who has died. The first night where this philosopher is saying the prayers, he finds out this girl just does not want to die. I know it sounds a little bit corny, but trust me, give Chip Slater's Storytime Theater a go listening to it and see if you don't agree. Next, I read Punk Ain't Undead by Ryan Hyatt, another delightful, hilarious Halloween story. It does feature the outbreak of a virus, but do not liken it to our recent pandemic. This one is completely different, and there are those who are immune to it. And how they are immune, it's so good. Guys, I cannot recommend Ryan Hyatt's writing enough. He's so versatile. I've read some of his science fiction, I've read speculative, I've read horror by him, and now we've got some comedy as well. I just cannot wait to see what he has next. And then I got into a little bit more of a serious read with The Art of Dogmeat by Priscilla Bettis. You're probably able to guess the subject matter from the title. The author's intent with this dystopian tale is to draw attention to the abject horror that is the dog meat industry. When children reach a certain age in this society known as the colony, they take what is called a childhood placement exam. The outcome of the exam chooses how they are going to go forward with their future. If a child scores low, they find themselves in a lower tier job. If they score very high, well, in that case, they're groomed for a better job, which means wealth and standing in this colony. Your job is everything. You are not allowed to quit. Our main character, Kalb, scored low on his exam and finds himself with the job of slaughtering dogs. I know that's a rough subject matter. Almost every single bit of it happens off page or is implied. As you can imagine, having this type of job would be very difficult, and that absolutely proves the case with Kalb because he is having suicidal thoughts. And what happens because of that? It's a fascinating story of how a government, a society, tries to control free will, and it's just not possible to kill the human spirit in all cases. It's just not. I read a new to me author I've been very curious about, Zoraida Cordova. I read The Inheritance of Arcadia Divina. When I first read this, I thought, this book was okay. I liked it okay. The more I talked about it, the more I thought about it, the more I enjoyed it. And what I enjoyed in this one was the development, the story, the history, the past, the present of the main character, Arcadia Divina. I loved how this one began. The members of the Montoya family begin receiving invitations to a funeral of a person who has not died yet. I mean, doesn't that sound interesting? I've never read anything that started like that. I was immediately drawn in, and I immediately was taken in by the character of Arcadia Divina. The narrative switches back and forth between past and present. Arcadia's past, which I loved, and the present as her family members are investigating where did Arcadia's magic come from. And I'll say in the beginning, I didn't care about any of the family members. I didn't care about their quest. I just wanted to know everything I could about Arcadia Divina. Once we got to the end, everything came together and I just saw how cleverly this narrative was structured. I changed my mind a little bit. I still don't care that much for the family, but I do appreciate the part that they played in it. So while it's not one that I loved and will reread time and time again, it is one that I enjoyed. I'm glad I read it, and I absolutely plan to read more by this author. My next book that I read is An Arc for Hell Signs by Ever Dundas, a science fiction dystopian thriller, and explores the perspectives of those that are wealthy and those that are the have-nots. They have been cast out because, and this is where it gets interesting, Hell Sands is a typeface. When you read it, see it, if you think your thoughts in Hell Sands, you experience bliss. I'm sorry. This book totally changed that word for me. I do not see that word bliss anymore without cringing just a little bit. So there are people who are allergic to this typeface. And because they are, the rest of society confines them to this place called the ghetto where they can barely survive. Lots of interesting things for this one. I read the first chapter and I thought, I'm not gonna like this. But then I read the next chapter and then I read the next chapter and then I read the next chapter. Suddenly I was hooked. The way this one is set up, it's 3 parts and you can either start with part 1 or part 2. So you can change how you wanna read it. In my opinion, start with part 2. Because part 1 reveals a lot of the things that makes the second part so much more interesting, and the second part I think will reel a reader in faster. There's a lot of interesting yet terrifying technology introduced in this novel. While the Inex was a little scary, by the end of the story I wanted my own, and Inexes are 8-inch looking little cyborg doll looking little things that kept up with everything. They monitored your health, they kept up with your appointments. If you hadn't had enough water, you're dehydrated, they'll let you know. Pretty cool, but a little creepy at the same time because they lived off insects. Oh, they would just be crawling on the wall like eating spiders and stuff, and I could just visualize that. Another funny thing, I read part 2 first. That character's perspective, Jane Ward, cannot stand her. Absolutely cannot stand her. But the character's perspective that we get in part 1, loved her, and she liked the other girl, so I had to like her because I wanted them to be together because there was a little bit of a love story involved and I wanted the two to be together, and And you know how it is, if you love somebody and they love somebody else, you want to try to like that person, and I just never got there with poor Jane. So this one, while it was a little bit outside my normal wheelhouse for what I choose, I'm so glad that I asked to read this one because it was very interesting. It really expanded my horizons and opened my eyes to how our government, society treats disabled people who are terminally ill, things of that nature. It was just a fascinating read. Next on the list, I read a collection of body horror short stories by Rob Ulitsky called Fleshed Out. This was a debut release that did not feel like a debut release. I did verify with the author because a lot of times I know works are published and called debut releases because it's the first thing they've published, but it's not necessarily the first thing the author has ever written. But he did say that he's worked on this collection for over a year and a half, and the time he took to polish this one up and get it ready is definitely well spent because the stories and the writing style was just top notch. And I love that there was a certain company and theme that tied all the stories together. I did read one story per day, and I posted a brief non-spoiler mini review on my Instagram as well as a written review, which all of these that I'm talking about today have written reviews. I'll put a link to my blog down in the description below if you want to check any of those out for a little more information on everything I'm talking about. And then moving into the next book that I read for the month of October, I read The Trials of Ashmount by John Palladino. This one ended up on my TBR in the most random of ways. I just saw a tweet from the author on Twitter saying they had sold 499 copies, and I decided I was going to be 500, dadgummit, and so I was. I responded to his tweet, and I was like, hey, I'm 500. Well, it turns out a bunch of my friends had already read and reviewed and loved this book, so I thought, I'm going to have to get this on my TBR right away. I'm so glad that I did. This is probably my most favorite grim dark book I've ever read, and I'm going to caution you, if you don't know that you love grim dark, don't try this book. You need to experiment with the grimdark genre first. These characters don't just think about what they're going to do, they act on their impulses, and some of those impulses are very dark. I loved it. Here's why. I've read so many books where characters struggle within themselves or finding themselves. They have thoughts, but they don't act on them. You know, they inevitably end up going with the better side of their nature. But every once in a while, I want somebody who's going to be different. I want somebody to do that thing that's on their mind. It feels realistic. It feels gritty. It got my blood pumping. I was turning those pages as fast as I could because I wanted to see what happened next. I loved all the characters. I love that you never knew what they were going to decide to do in a day. There are reasons for their actions, although sometimes the characters themselves don't even know why they do the things they do. I loved it. I absolutely loved it. If book 2 had already been released, or even if there was an arc for book 2, I was begging the author, I'm like, when can I get something else from this world? And in fact, is it my favorite read of the month? Yeah. The Trials of Ashmount is my favorite book that I read the entirety of the month of October. I usually wait and reveal that at the end of the video, but we'll just roll with it. Next, I read the illustrated version of Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. Now, this one did not have as many illustrations in it, and it's probably because it's a little bit longer than the first book. The illustrated versions are just so good. Even though this one was chock full of spiders. There were spiders everywhere. I was having to be so careful turning pages because I didn't even want to touch an illustration of a spider. That's how serious it is. And then next, I read a favorite author, Autumn Gothic by Brian Bowyer. I love Brian Bowyer's writing style. It's so matter of fact. It's so snappy. And everybody dies. You know that joke? Somebody's like, hey, what happened in that one? And inevitably some troll is going to be like, everybody dies. I mean, I do it. I do it all the time. It's funny to me. Even though I know that with Brian, you don't know what manner somebody is going to be taken out or in what order. This one had so much going on in it that I absolutely love, that are buzzwords for me. Serial killer, haunted houses, ghosts, vampires, whiskey. There is no such thing as a Brian Bowyer story without whiskey involved. If you know, you know. You read one Brian Bowyer and you love it, then you are going to love everything this author has written or will write. And I'm telling you, it's just the freaking best. So fun. I loved it. I was grinning the whole time I read that book. And even though he killed some dogs in there, happened off page, you don't see it happen. But it's Brian Boyer. He's the only one that gets forgiven for that type of thing. Next, I completed a trilogy. Yes, I completed a series. I have about 50 of them going at this point. So I finished Mistborn Era 1. I was underwhelmed by the Hero of Ages. I spent the majority of it bored out of my skull. We took the long way around. We ended up in Albuquerque more than once. But unfortunately, with this installment of the trilogy, for me, Era 1 as a trilogy loses its reread capability. If I do reread it, it'll just be the first 2 novels, and then I'll probably just pick up this one to read the last chapter. Sanderson's early works are hit or miss for me. I followed the Hero of Ages up with Sarah Gailey's The Echo Wife. I do not have the physical book anymore because my best friend came to town the day after I finished it. I was telling him about it and he wanted to borrow it, so I let him have it. The day that he flew home, he spent the day reading it and he loved it. This is one of those times that happens occasionally with me. When I finished it, I thought this was okay. I did not really like any of the characters. I did not attach to them. I liked the premise a whole lot, but there were a lot of things introduced that I would have loved to have seen the author use their creative juices to give me an answer of some sort. I know it's not the answer because it's in regards to cloning, and those answers don't exist yet for us, but I would have loved to have seen what the author could have created for it. I've come to realize that story really took hold in my brain, and I've just thought about it. I've thought how I would love if Sarah Gailey wrote another installment from a different character's perspective, maybe a couple of decades from now. And I thought, you know what? I liked that book more than I thought I did. I definitely loved the ideas and themes behind Sarah Gailey's writing. I will absolutely read more by them. I highly encourage you to consume this one in audiobook because I feel it was just a little bit better of a reading experience. Next was an adventure for me. I binged a trilogy that was not on my TBR. It was on my long-term TBR. It was not on my October TBR. But here's what had happened. I got an email from my website from a publicist, Lucy. She says, Leslie, I am with Saga Press. I would like to offer you the art for Nick Martell's finale to his trilogy, The Voyage of the Forgotten. After I got finished jumping for joy that someone from Saga Press was offering me an ARC, because that is one of my favorite publishers. They publish a lot of my favorite authors through Saga Press and Simon & Schuster. I was over the freaking moon. You might have seen the short where I was jumping up and down. I whacked my foot on my desk very loudly and it hurt. So I wanted this opportunity. The only problem was I had not read the first 2 books in the trilogy. I did tell Lucy, hey, I have not read the first 2 books. I have them here because my friend Ev was kind enough to share The Kingdom of Liars with me. Well, I went ahead and got book 2 when it came out to matchy, and then Lucy sent me book 3. In 7 days time, I did written reviews and then I released my video reviews over 3 days time, ending on release date, which was November 1st for The Voyage of the Forgotten. This trilogy as a whole was a win. You know, if you love fantasy stories that involve people conning one another, political power plays for the throne, similar to Game of Thrones, but not nearly as bloody. Clever, yes. Bloody, not so much. I loved learning how the society functioned, what its structure was, the hierarchy between the different classes. I loved the found family aspect the most. As someone who knows personally the value of family that chooses you as family rather than blood, this trilogy excelled in the found family trope. 3 left. I read Her Body and Other Parties by Carmen Maria Machado. Love their writing style. There was some of it that went over my head. There's a couple of stories I didn't understand, but perhaps I will experience some things in my life over the coming years. I can reread them and either have an understanding of the author's intent or at least be able to infer my own. One of them is called Mothers. I'm not a mother. I did not have a good mother. So I think that might have been why there was a little disconnect with that particular one. The funniest is a novella that's called Especially Heinous. I thought I'm going to probably end up skipping this one, but I ended up loving it. It was my favorite of the whole entire collection. I didn't think I was going to like it because it's written in episode synopsis format of Law and Order. I never watched Law and Order SVU, but I knew who the two characters were. You know how each episode has its theme, but there's also a theme that's going to keep going about the characters throughout the entire season? Vincent and Stabler not only have doppelgangers who seem to be living the better version of their lives, they also are haunted by ghosts and things. It was just delightful. I love how Carmen Maria Machado took weird psychological realism, science fiction, fantasy, horror, and just crafted these stories. I am a fan. I believe they have some full-length novels that I'm gonna have to get my hands on next. If you have a favorite that they've written, put that title down in the comments below. I will read whichever one I see the most down there. Then my final two things that I read for the month are by the same author, Junji Ito's two newest releases, Black Paradox, Dissolving Classroom. This one I would say borrow from your library. Junji Ito explored what could possibly happen to a soul after death. And Black Paradox, the soul is a commodity. While it brings wealth, the more it's used could result in erasing the human race. This one, however, Dissolving Classroom, this is Ito at his finest. This is what I look for when I pick up Junji Ito. I love when he blends horror with occult. This is about a pair of siblings who bring terror to wherever it is they go. The older sibling, the brother, is obsessed with the devil, and the youngest sister is the worst little sister in history. And we read about the different things that happen as they move from place to place. I loved it. Absolutely loved it. And with that, those are all of the things that I have read during the month of October. I read a lot looking at this pile. It might be a little obvious how much this girl likes to read. And don't forget, if you have a favorite book by Carmen Maria Machado, please put the title of it in the comments below so I can pick what's going to be my next thing to read by that author. Thank you so much for being here and watching and seeing what all I read. I hope I discovered something new in a genre that you love, something you might want to pick up and try out for yourselves. Have a fantastic rest of your day, and I'll catch you in the next one.